Hello and welcome to the third in the series of presentations for Work-Based Supervisors. My name is Jennifer Simpson and I work for Nottingham Trent University. As you can see, we are going to be focusing on troubleshooting and problem-solving techniques and approaches for student placements. The presentation will cover the following areas: factors that lead to difficulties in placement, indicators that a student is at risk of failing, emotional responses to difficulties, failure in placement, working effectively with difficulties and/or failing students, and finally, university procedures. Social work placements are a mandatory and necessary part of social work training. That said, it doesn't mean that this aspect of either a BA or MA program is without difficulty. A series of studies by Burgess in 1998 identified that there are 7 main and often interconnected reasons why placements were unsuccessful. These include the personal circumstances of students, for example, their health, bereavement, family tragedy, a personality clash between the student and the practice educator or work-based supervisor, travelling distance from the student's home to the placement not providing enough or the right work experience, insufficient support for the student, inexperience of the practice educator, and finally the student's academic or writing ability. It will come as no surprise that Burgess also found that students who failed placements felt very unhappy and often cited a lack of choice of placement as well as relationships with their practice educator as a problem leading to failure. From the perspective of practice educators, they identified the following reasons for placement breakdown: poor communication and interpersonal skills, a lack of basic ability, poor understanding of the social work role, an absence of professional boundaries, a lack of motivation and unwillingness to learn on the part of the student. Importantly, Burgess's study also noted that practice educators were deemed as a significant factor in the breakdown of a student's placement for the following reasons: displaying unclear communication skills, poor assessment ability, and showing unprofessional conduct. Other factors identified included poor communication with the work-based supervisor, as well as poor communication between the practice educator and work-based supervisor. Additionally, the research of Burgess also noted a lack of experience on the part of the work-based supervisor. So what we can see as a key factor in relation to student placements, particularly where difficulties are experienced, is the issue of communication. It can be said that communication is a key aspect for a successful placement. Returning to the work of Burgess again, factors that are influential on student placements are, firstly, the personal attributes and skills of the practice educator, the gender match between the practice educator and the student. And this is important because actually what Burgess found was that more male students failed with female practice educators. The quality of the learning experience, the quality of supervision and relevance of learning, and finally the knowledge and enthusiasm of the practice educator. So what we can take from this is that the practice educator is a key influence on the success of a placement. Another factor that has been identified by Finch and Taylor is the issue of role tension. The literature in relation to practice education states that the role of the practice educator includes potentially conflictual roles. Specifically, the practice educator can be seen as a nurturer and enabler of learning on the one hand and an assessor on the other. When the role of you as the work-based supervisor is added, there can potentially be role confusion, with students not being clear about who does what. A further factor that leads to difficulties within a placement is expectation by all the parties involved. That includes the student, the practice educator, and you as a work-based supervisor, as well as the personal tutor. An example of this is where you or the practice educator have in mind what can be termed as the ideal learner, which is based on essentially a fantasy of what you hope the student will be like after a few days of being in placement. You and the practice educator may be looking for passion, commitment, initiative, and motivation. You or the practice educator may go as far as comparing what you are like as a student with the student who is in placement. Such thoughts represent unsaid expectations which the student is more than likely to be judged by. Finch and Taylor put it this way: the gap between expectations and reality may impact adversely on the assessment process, and it seems that the focus of the practice educator's intervention centered on making the student the ideal learner rather than on undertaking a realistic assessment of the student's competence. So it's important to recognize that such thinking does happen with work-based supervisors. It may be that you are being slowly persuaded to adopt such a view based on your regular conversations with the practice educator you are working with. Simply put, what you may be experiencing and understanding are unrealistic expectations of the student. A potential reason for this is because the core professional knowledge and identity that you make use of in your daily work is habitual and unconscious. And therefore, what that means is you're viewing the student from the perspective of those behaviors without giving the student an opportunity to learn. And without doing this, this will in turn create a series of difficulties. So let's think about this in terms of an example. You regularly may have quite difficult conversations with service users that are often tense, and you have an effective way of managing those. To expect a student who's been with you for 2 weeks to do exactly the same would be deemed unrealistic. Another not so obvious factor is the nature of the work being undertaken by the student. This is specifically where students have a misunderstanding regarding the type of social work they are undertaking and what is expected of them in terms of case recording. Students may not be aware of the bureaucratic nature of the work that has to be undertaken, i.e. forms have to be filled out, case notes have to be written according to certain ways of writing, and also within certain deadlines. And they also need to be computer literate. Students may think that they are not being given the opportunity to exercise their communication and empathic skills with service users. In such circumstances, it's about helping the student recognize both the informal and formal interactions that they are having with service users and what they are learning from these. Another factor that can lead to difficulties in a placement are organisational expectations. In other words, what's required by the student and how they're to do it, either in their first or second placement. An example of this might be that the organisation expects the student to get on with it like other members of staff. In one sense, learning has to be by doing. However, the expectation is that students are able to perform as if they are in a new job, again, is unrealistic, particularly when you think about the students' learning is centered around becoming a social work practitioner, not being a social work practitioner. Finally, Bray and Nettleton comment that a lack of agreed and consistent roles and expectations are likely to result in uncertainty and anxiety about whether the student is failing. We've already touched on this in terms of the ideal student. Therefore, where the practice educator or you as a work-based supervisor are not clear about your roles, and the student is not clear, then what that means is that there is likely to be a series of contradictory expectations. Therefore, it's key that you as the work-based supervisor and the practice educator have a common understanding regarding the expectations of the student, and this is grounded in the professional capabilities framework. So what are the key messages that we can take in terms of thinking about the factors that potentially lead to placement breakdown? Well, firstly, the poor communication skills by members of the placement team often take place and often results in confusion and potentially breakdown in a placement. Another message that we can take is that poor assessment and unprofessional conduct by the practice educator has a negative effect upon the student. The third message that we can take is a lack of role clarification between the practice educator and you as the work-based supervisor is likely to lead to not only confusion, but also the student being unclear about the expectations of them. The fourth message that we can take is that of unrealistic expectations of the student, and that's held by either the practice educator or both the practice educator and the work-based supervisor. And the final message that we can take is that in relation to the work being undertaken by the student, it's not what he or she expects. And therefore it's important that students are given a clear understanding of the role that they are to carry out and the work that's contained within that role. So in terms of the presentation, we're now going to turn our attention to what are the indicators that a student is failing. So in 2015, practice educators at a training event listed a number of traits and behaviours that indicated a struggling or failing student. These included avoidance, struggling with reflection, unable to analyse a situation, unable to recognise complexity in a situation or scenario, dishonesty, concerns around the student's value base, the student blaming others for their own mistakes, not completing a reflective diary or refusing to share it, lack of confidence, lack of boundaries, lack of professionalism, not motivated or enthusiastic, personal or family issues overwhelming the placement, absent through ill health or other circumstances, needing to social work the student him or herself, invading personal space and boundaries, and not following clear and direct instructions, and not preparing adequately. Other indicators that point to the fact that a student might be failing include poor timekeeping, over talking and not listening, not producing work, producing poor quality work, unable to relate theory to practice, and avoiding supervision. Despite the length of the list, it's important to remember that all students will experience difficulties and challenges at some point during their placement. This may ultimately lead to blocks to learning. Another way of thinking about it is if you start a new job. So when you do that, you may have feelings of trepidation, apprehension, and nervousness. And these are likely to influence what you hear and retain in the first few days. As a work-based supervisor, you will recognize that there's a problem if the blocks to learning continue. The list that I've just gone through was provided by a number of Scottish practice educators, and this list tends to focus on behaviours exhibited by the student as opposed to thinking about those behaviours in terms of the assessment criteria and also the expectations that are laid out clearly in their university handbooks. Furthermore, the descriptors given are negative, and the danger is that they can become not only a way of thinking, but also speaking about the students. Williams and Rutter usefully identify the following, and what you'll see is that the language is much more neutral. Firstly, failure to fully engage with the learning process. Personal or health issues that reduce the student's capacity to fully engage with or complete tasks. Lack of confidence that affects autonomous practice, safe decision making, and resilience. Lack of necessary critical reflection, analysis, and self-awareness. Lack of professionalism in the sense of poor timekeeping and a failure to follow procedures. Issues with values, for example, not recognizing the impact of their personal values upon their practice and how that might be discriminatory or even oppressive. Issues with learning or assessment, for example, not providing evidence of capability at the appropriate standard and not making the expected progress that is required. Research on social work practice placements in the UK has identified that there are certain groups of students that are at greater risk of failing social work training than others. These include female students of African origin, disabled students, male students, and in particular, black male students. Additionally, research has shown that progression for black and minority students in terms of completing their social work training is slower when compared with their white counterparts, and many of these students have to either retake modules or their placements. These students are disproportionately represented in the number of students that fail. It's also been found that the same is true for students who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. They too experience slow progression. Schwab has argued that men are most likely to withdraw or fail a social work program. So when we think about this begs the question, why are there such outcomes for certain groups of students compared to others, particularly for a profession that is committed to and has at its core anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory practice? Finch states that practitioners need to be aware of their own unconscious bias as well as the structural discrimination and oppression that are inherent in university assessment systems. And these systems are based on westernized norms and practices. It's important for all those involved in student placements that they are open and aware of the structural oppression that exists and are honestly considering the inherent power that is within their role. So for you as a work-based supervisor, whilst you may not undertake the assessment of the student, you have inordinate power in terms of the information that you share with the practice educator. And as you can well appreciate, the practice educator has ultimate power in terms of whether or not that student passes their placement. So let's take a few minutes to sum up what we've been looking at. And as you can see, one of the key messages is that students will at some point experience difficulties or challenges in their placement. It's really important that we avoid negative descriptors regarding the student, and instead what we need to do is look at students through the lens of the PCF. We need to remember that the progress for disabled, male, black and minority, and also LGBT students is often slower. The next message linked to that is that we need to be aware of our own unconscious bias and the structural oppression that exists. And finally, we need to give honest consideration to the power that is held even as a work-based supervisor. And whilst you're not assessing the student, you still hold an inordinate amount of power in terms of the information that is shared. And you will also have an opportunity to comment on the student's practice as part of their final practice educator report. It would be naive to think that working with a student who is struggling does not have an emotional impact upon you as a work-based supervisor. In research by Finch and Taylor, they spoke to the practice educators about what they felt when a placement was breaking down. Those practice educators that took part in their research spoke about feeling guilty, having sleepless nights, and the implications of what this meant for the student's future career. Other practice educators felt great regret at not being able to manage the situation better. Other practice educators were actually angry with the social work student because they were not able to organise themselves and were not prepared for their placements. Finch and Taylor conclude working with a struggling or failing student can potentially invoke intensely uncomfortable feelings in both the practice educator and work-based supervisor. Such feelings that are discomforting are in actual fact not unusual, and they've been recorded in other research studies relating to placements in other professions such as nursing. What's important to recognize are your own emotions in terms of the student and how your emotions may be affected by those of the practice educator. It's important that you discuss what you are feeling and why you are feeling these emotions with the practice educator as part of ensuring that your emotional distress does not cloud the conclusions reached about the student. It's also important to remember that a student failing or struggling in a placement is likely to be experiencing a range of uncomfortable and difficult emotions, such as anger, guilt, confusion, and distress. Furthermore, the student may project such feelings onto you as a work-based supervisor or the practice educator. Where this is the case, Mattison states that instead of reacting, rather, you should take the opportunity to consider how the student is feeling, which could help you enable them to develop their learning and their thinking. Secondly, it's also important in the sense of enabling you to think about the dynamics that are taking place and what is emerging in relation to the student, the practice educator, and you. An understanding of transference and counter-transference and reflection on the feelings of all the parties involved could help contain the situation and benefit the student, as well as yourself and the practice educator, but ultimately service users. Next, we're going to look at working effectively with struggling or failing students. And we're going to cover 3 areas: being clear about roles and responsibilities, stating clearly what our concerns are, and having courageous conversations. So let's begin by looking at clarity around roles and responsibilities. As stated previously, one of the most effective ways that you can work with a struggling student is by ensuring that the student understands all roles and responsibilities. And information about this can be found in their handbook. It's important that the student understands your role and what information you provide to the practice educator. Additionally, it's important that the student understand that the practice educator is responsible for undertaking a fair and transparent assessment and for applying the PCF. It's also important that the student understand their role, and again, information about this can be found in the placement handbook. As a reminder, the role of the student is to adhere to the policies and procedures of confidentiality, GDPR, and other information sharing at all times. Student must take note that failure to do so could result in automatic failure of the module. Another responsibility that students have is to access support services relevant to any identified needs that they may have in order to minimize difficulties and promote the smooth running of the placement. Students are to attend practice on a full-time basis as specified in their learning agreement. Students are required to attend placement for between 35 and 37 hours a week. Students are to participate in the preparation of the aims and objectives of the placement learning period and in practicing learning visits. They're to attend and participate fully in supervision sessions. And that can be obviously with a practice educator, but also with you as a work-based supervisor. And they are all also expected to undertake work as directed by you, the work-based supervisor, and also any work that is directed by the practice educator. As the student placement proceeds, it's important that you note any concerns that you have and then go on to discuss them with the practice educator. In terms of the concerns, ensure that they are specific and that you have examples. Also ensure that you, in the first instance, where you noted a concern, that you check it with the student. It's important that the student be given an opportunity to change and to offer an explanation. You might find that there is a misunderstanding or that the student was not clear about a particular policy or procedure within the organisation. Where clarity has been sought and a discussion had, and the student is clear about what should happen, then there should be no further concerns. In other words, you may have witnessed a temporary block to learning. However, if you find that the issue arises more than once and the student is failing to take on board what was discussed, then it is likely that you're dealing with issues that are more long-term. And therefore it's important that you share this detail with the practice educator who may also have concerns that are stemming from supervision. So as you can see there, you need to distinguish between short-term blocks in learning and an ongoing concern. It's important that you and the practice educator agree a way forward and, where necessary, have a three-way meeting with the student to discuss the concerns raised. Here again, the student must be given an opportunity to explain the matter from his or her perspective, and then a way forward should be found via an action plan, which clearly states what changes are needed, what they look like, and by when. Again, it's important for you for the practice educator to note this as part of a holistic assessment of the student. So now let's move to courageous conversations. So what do I mean by courageous conversations? Well, the term was developed by Beddoe and Davies in 2016 and can be thought of as, in actual fact, just saying it as it is. However, such conversations have the following characteristics. They are associated with some form of emotion. Those involved in the conversation may experience feelings of embarrassment, anger, or apprehension. The conversation is conflicted in the sense of having different perspectives, ideas, values, or behaviors. The conversations may cause conflict and hurt. The conversation is likely to have a significant impact on the existing relationships. More often than not, our natural instinct is to avoid having such conversations in order not to hurt or offend a person. However, the danger with not having such conversations is that the issue becomes worse and the placement may become more fraught. It may even go as far as putting a service user at risk. And so again, what's needed is a three-way meeting between yourself, the student, and the practice educator. Alternatively, the practice educator may want to contact the student's personal tutor to have a conversation. So let's just remind ourselves of what a courageous conversation is. It's difficult and it tends to provoke uncomfortable emotions. It's likely to have an impact on existing relationships. Ultimately, it's a great way of resolving any difficulties or concerns, and these difficulties and concerns can be effectively resolved through an action plan. So ultimately, what should an action plan look like in terms of its characteristics? Well, it should be stating clearly and explicitly what the concerns are. It should also show how the concerns are linked to areas that require further development on the part of the student. It should show what support is needed by the student and how it will be provided and by whom. It should state clearly and explicitly what improvement looks like in a way that the student can understand. And finally, what it's got to show is when the action plan will be reviewed. If there is a lack of improvement or change after a review of the action plan, this may in actual fact trigger a formal concern. This is a process that involves the university. The practice educator will lead on this. However, it's important that the practice educator liaise with you as the work-based supervisor, and that if the student has any questions regarding the formal concerns, it's important that you as the work-based supervisor direct the student either to the practice educator or to the student's personal tutor. As said previously, if there is a lack of improvement or change after the review of an action plan, this may trigger a formal concern. And as you can see there, on the left of the slide is the process that's involved. And really, the emphasis here is to seek to resolve any issues or concerns within the placement informally in the first instance. And you should only really be moving to concerns meetings where there are continual concerns of a long-standing nature across the placement. Alternatively, you may move to a concerns meeting because of issues around the practice of the student in terms of putting service users at risk or breaching confidentiality or issues of that nature. So let's take the opportunity to recap on steps to working effectively with students. So step 1, don't assume that if a student can do one thing, they can do another. In other words, avoid making assumptions. Step 2, if you are able to work out the emotional dynamics that are in play, then it's likely that you're able to understand to some extent the emotions that the student is projecting on you, and if so, what is being communicated by the student. And that means that you are then in a position to reflect this back to the student in a calm and professional manner. If you can't, then begin to speak to the practice educator and have a discussion as to how this can be effectively managed. Step 3, manage your own emotions by not overreacting and reflecting on what is happening. Step 4, in conjunction with the practice educator, contain the emotional climate, which may involve, for you, experiencing discomfort. But what you need to remember is that all times your behaviours need to be measured. And what that does is it provides an opportunity for the student to witness professionalism. Step 5, continue to give ongoing feedback in a way that acknowledges that there is still the necessary time and room for change to happen. Finch states that feedback should be owned, actionable, facilitative, non-ambiguous, and focus on 2 or 3 key things. Ensure that feedback being given is consistent with what has been said by the practice educator. Step 6, remember your role and responsibilities as part of ensuring that you do not take on activities and tasks that are not within your remit. Step 7, aim to resolve any difficulties informally in the first instance in conjunction with the practice educator and also the student. Step 8, ensure clear communication by checking in regularly not only with the student but also with the practice educator. Give every opportunity for the student to check their understanding. Step 9, ensure at all times the channels of communication remain open between you and the practice educator. Step 10, if the student states that they want to complain about what's happening, you need to point them in the direction of their personal tutor who will make contact with them and then signpost them to university procedures. Without doubt, challenges and difficulties that arise during a social work practice placement can be rather daunting. But one thing I want to leave you with is remember that you are not alone, but in actual fact, you're part of a team with the practice educator and the personal tutor. And you can always go back to these 2 people and discuss what's happening within a placement.
So here you can see a series of references with regards to what we've discussed today. So if you're interested in reading about this much more, please do make use of the references, and I hope that they will help you to be even more informed about your role as work-based supervisor. Thanks very much. Finally, just to say a huge thank you again for your incredible job as a work-based supervisor, and I hope that you find this presentation useful. Thank you very much.